everyone, and a very warm welcome. On behalf of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, Christchurch Branch, I'm pleased to welcome you today to this session titled The Middle East Conflict, Reshaping the Global Order and New Zealand's Future. My name is Sandeep Sharma, Chair of NZIIA Christchurch Branch, and I'll be moderating the session today. So briefly on the format before we begin, we will have a 45-minute discussion followed by a 15-minute Q&A. So please share your questions here in the chat box throughout the session. These will be curated by our branch secretary, Max Mitchell, and will be addressed during the Q&A session. So warm greetings to our members, our student community, and the supporting student clubs joining us today. The strong response to this event reflects just how timely and important this conversation is. In fact, it is probably the highest RSVP event in the history of the branch. The situation in the Middle East today is one of the most pressing geopolitical developments globally. While often seen through the lens of rising energy prices, inflation, and supply chain disruptions, its implications run much deeper. The evolving tensions have drawn in actors across region, from the Gulf to Europe and across Asia and the Pacific. This expanding scope is precisely why this matters to New Zealand. As a globally connected economy and a country invested in a stable, rule-based international order, this conflict matters to New Zealand and the wider Pacific. So to help us unpack this complexity, we are joined by two outstanding experts. We have Mahdi Ghuloom, a junior fellow for geopolitics at the Observer Research Foundation in the Middle East, specializing in Gulf states' economic competitiveness, political institutions, and diplomacy. He has previously worked as a regional security analyst with key government and economic institutions in Bahrain and is soon to graduate from the University of Oxford. Mahdi today joins us from Bahrain, his hometown, where he's driven last night from Dubai, where he was based all this while. We are also fortunate to be joined by Dr. Geoffrey Miller, a New Zealand geopolitical analyst who recently completed his PhD in politics at the University of Otago with a thesis on New Zealand's relations with the Gulf states. Recognized among the top doctoral theses, he brings deep regional insights, having lived in both Germany and the Middle East, and is a longtime student of Arabic. Geoffrey joins us today from sunny Dunedin. Now, we are fortunate to have both of them with us today. And without further ado, if I could invite them to give their opening remarks, beginning with Mahdi. Mahdi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just want to start by, of course, thanking everyone who's attending with us today. It was interesting when advertising this event. There were 3 time zones that I highlighted. It was 5 p.m. New Zealand time, 8 a.m. Dubai, and 7 a.m. Bahrain. And I happened to travel from Dubai, where I would have attended at 8 a.m. to Bahrain, where I'm attending now at 7 a.m. It's a pleasure to join you all. I just want to start by saying, of course, the recent events have been a shock, and I think we'll go into why it has been a shock and as we move forward. But it's something that, on the one hand, has been a shock for all the Gulf states, especially kind of the most impacted Gulf states, which are the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain. But that's not to discount kind of the impact that the rest of the Gulf has also felt, from Oman to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, with sirens, at least in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE almost daily, definitely at night as well. And keeping in mind that this is happening during the month of Ramadan, which a lot of people tend to spend their evenings in gatherings, and of course, Eid coming up tomorrow or the day after, in some countries across the Gulf, varying to different dates of the Islamic calendar. But that the Eid is something that's also being disrupted, with decisions being made now in Kuwait and the UAE, from what I can trace, of banning outdoor gatherings, restricting the celebrations inside mosques. So this is a Ramadan and Eid like like no other. And that is what people are feeling on a daily impact. Of course, the casualties and injuries have been largely minimal compared to the degree of attacks that have happened. The number of attacks, we're talking about over 3,000 attacks on the Gulf states by Iran since February 28th, but the bulk of that towards the UAE. And the the thing that has been quite illuminating is how much the strategic relationship with the United States and the kind of the Western alliances have benefited the Gulf in terms of access to military supplies, defensive arsenals, which have proven to be quite useful and have minimized the impact so far through the air defenses that have been deployed. So that is, of course, a positive. Now, of course, there's also a bit of a recalculation about how much the Gulf was, um, uh, taken as a stakeholder in the decision to ensue in this war, and whether there was enough consideration being made to being impacted by the war and being attacked by Iran. In Iran's words, these attacks are discriminating between U.S. bases, but what we're seeing on the ground is, of course, an indiscriminate attack on civilian architecture, on critical infrastructure, and people have died, and many have been injured. And in Bahrain, where I'm currently, there were 32 injuries in one attack in a village that was next to the refinery. Presumably, the refinery was being targeted. Ultimately, this has led to economic implications with what's known as a force majeure, a new term that everyone has become familiar with now in the Gulf, where basically there's a legal clause for industries not to export globally based on unprecedented events and unlikely um, or things that that is out of their control. And we've seen that with our refinery in Bahrain. We've seen that with our aluminium exports, um, petrochemicals, gas. So these have all been impacted. And we've seen the same across the Gulf to varying degrees with national industries. So this will have a global impact moving forward, especially as the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted. So that's just on the ground picture, but I also want to give a bit of a perspective on what I think the ramifications will be a bit uh, globally and maybe to New Zealand to a certain extent. And I think it's important to mention that the same challenges that we're seeing here in terms of potential divides in national unity and sectarianism rising and hidden cells and potential terror threats. All of these are considerations that I'm sure uh, New Zealand authorities will also have to consider uh, to a varying degree of potential, sectarianism rising among certain parts of the population and things like that. And of course, the threat of terror is a threat that's unfortunate on a global scale. And that is something as well that we're concerned with in the Gulf, and I'm sure the globe also has to be concerned with as the ramifications of this conflict, um, spread across borders. That's an important aspect. And the last aspect are, in terms of how much the Gulf is a home to a multitude of nationalities, including citizens from New Zealand. So that is something that has been the utmost priority, at least in the UAE where I was. There has been no differentiation in terms of the prioritization of the authorities towards citizens and towards people who are residents and expats and tourists. And there has been ultimate effort to try and open up the airspace, to try and ensure that the connectivity is up to standard to make sure that people can go home safely, or at least they feel safe within the country that they're residing. And that, I think, is the picture that we're seeing across the Gulf, because I think ultimately the authorities here realize that the Gulf is not just a home to citizens, but is also a home to a multitude of nationalities from across the world. It has grown to become a hub, and the ramifications of Iran's attacks will be felt. The tremors will be felt across families throughout the world who have either lived here in the past or currently live here or have lived over the past 2 weeks and have left. So I'll end here and happy to receive any questions as we move forward, and really looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Mahdi. Can I now invite Geoffrey for your opening comments, please?
Sure. Good afternoon, Sandeep. Good morning to you, Mahdi, and hello to everyone on the call. Uh, as Sandeep said in his introduction, I'm Geoffrey Miller. I completed my PhD just last year on New Zealand's relations with the Gulf states. So obviously, I've got a keen interest in what's happening at the moment, and having traveled to the Gulf many times, for my research for other trips, uh, it is still quite a shock, isn't it, to see these pictures on our TV screens or phone screens each day at the moment. And we're only 2.5 weeks in, and things seem to be getting worse, not better, overall. I was in the Gulf last month for the last time, just a month ago or so, over in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And some of the pictures that are coming out. Remember, the US Embassy was hit in Riyadh. To an extent, some of the damage is being uh, not necessarily covered up, but we're not seeing necessarily the full extent. It is a war situation here, and the Gulf states do have an interest in projecting stability, keeping people calm. And I think we'd probably do much the same thing if it were New Zealand being attacked in a different way. I think morale is important and keeping a sense of normality is important. But the damage is not necessarily on every street, but some of the targets that have been hit, obviously, airports, ports, significant buildings, structures, air bases, what have you. It is significant in those locations. Look, there's so much going on right now. It's hard to keep up with everything. In a sense, I think it's important to start with the numbers and particularly the human cost of this war. And then I will move on to talk about some of the wider effects and New Zealand's position on the war, where I think I can add perhaps the most value. But just already in the 2.5 weeks of this war has been ongoing, we've got more than 1,400 killed in Iran, uh, more than 900 killed in Lebanon, 21 killed is the latest figure across the Gulf states, 29 in Iraq, 28 injured in Jordan, 15 deaths in Israel, 13 deaths amongst the US military, uh, 3.2 million displaced persons in Iran, 830,000 displaced persons in Lebanon. And those are just some numbers to just put this all in context and what we're dealing with. Huge numbers of injuries are being caused, obviously, by the bombing in Iran and throughout the region, the retaliatory strikes then from Iran. And we've got now a dozen countries thereabouts involved, from uh, Oman in the south. Salalah was hit, right through to Azerbaijan, Cyprus in the north. It's a huge swathe of the Middle East that is impacted. Then you have, of course, the economic cost. The US spent just in the first, I think, 10 days of the war, 16.5 billion US dollars on this conflict. It's an enormous sum when you think of what that money could go towards. The figures of economic contraction, if this war continues through until April, Goldman Sachs has predicted that GDP in Qatar and Kuwait could contract by 14%. And those countries, those Gulf countries, those smaller ones there in the Gulf are more at risk in a sense because they've got fewer options in terms of getting products to market. The likes of Saudi Arabia, which has a Red Sea coast, it's a slightly easier proposition. But some of those smaller countries are really caught around there, and their only way out is really through the Strait of Hormuz or by air or by working through with the other Gulf states. Nevertheless, the markets seem to be betting on a short, sharp war. If you look at the figures, the S&P in the United States is only down around 3% since the war began. It's not actually a massive dip, uh, despite the carnage that we are seeing across the Middle East. But I wouldn't be so sure about the short, sharp war. Donald Trump predicts 4 to 5 weeks. In fact, there were reports that he was telling allies it would be all over in about 4 days, as Trump is finding out that these things tend to gain momentum all of their own and get out of control and get out of hand. And if you look at the poly market, prediction market, which is known to be used by insiders, including from Donald Trump's own administration, only 8% now think that the conflict will be over by the end of March, and only 45% now think that the war will end by the end of next month, that is, by the end of April. Those figures have been dropping this week. I've been updating those figures. So confidence is declining that this war will end that quickly. So why is that? Well, fundamentally, the United States is trying to win this war from the air. We have not really seen a serious plan in terms of a ground invasion, and that is difficult. It's really, really difficult to find examples in history of wars being won from the air alone. The closest example that you can come up with is NATO's bombing of the Serbs in Kosovo in 1999, where there was a 78-day bombing campaign, and then there was a withdrawal. But even in that case, NATO had ground troops stationed in Macedonia ready to go in, and there were ground troops available. In this conflict, Iran simply needs to survive. It simply needs to fight back, as it is doing with these drone strikes and ballistic missile strikes. Now, the numbers have been dropping overall over the 2.5 weeks, and yet Iran is still managing to send out these volleys of ballistic missiles, and particularly drones, every day. Those drones in particular are hard to stop. They're quite portable in terms of launch sites, and they are being still sent in large numbers. But even the ballistic missiles, Saudi Arabia was on the receiving end of quite a large volley of ballistic missiles over the last 24 hours or so. The UAE as well, just today, had quite a lot to deal with in terms of cluster munitions being sent its way. So Iran still obviously has the ability and wherewithal to fight back and to have this de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz as a result. And that's really all it needs to do. It is not as if the United States has invaded and taken any territory that it is trying to regain. In other words, like in Ukraine, that is not the case. It simply needs to survive. You've had the decapitation strikes, as Donald Trump would see them, on not just the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, but also others in the regime, notably the head of the National Security Council today, Ali Larijani. And that is also going to be having some kind of galvanizing effect amongst support for the regime. And there is no real evidence at this point that the regime is under a state of collapse, despite the enormous campaigns from the air. So asymmetric warfare is what we're seeing from Iran, and that is their modus operandi. When it comes to New Zealand's position, New Zealand released its first statement on the war, its first substantive statement, on the 1st of March. That was the Sunday the war began, Saturday night, New Zealand time. And by Sunday morning, we had a full statement outlining New Zealand's position issued by the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, and the Foreign Minister, Winston Peters. And that statement condemned Iran's retaliatory attacks, used the word acknowledge to describe the US-Israeli campaign. So New Zealand did not openly support the campaign, but provided a level of acceptance of the US-Israeli strikes. And for those of you in New Zealand who followed this, Christopher Luxon got himself tied up in knots to a degree the following day when he was asked about New Zealand's position after his weekly post-cabinet press conference. I think it's also notable to say in that statement, New Zealand called for a resumption of negotiations and adherence to international law, and we urged the Iranian leadership to seek a negotiated solution that returns Iran to the community of nations. So New Zealand was calling for negotiations there. And remember, all wars end. The only question is how they end. Will they end by a decisive victory, or will they end in some kind of negotiated solution? Most wars end in some kind of diplomatic effort. So what has New Zealand been doing since the 1st of March in terms of this war? I think it is interesting. The New Zealand Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, held quite an early phone call with the UAE President, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, on the 4th of March. Now, that came at quite an early stage. It came ahead of calls with from the UAE president with the leaders of bigger states such as Romania, such as the Netherlands, even Indonesia. And we should remember New Zealand has focused on the Gulf states in quite a big way. Across this current government in New Zealand that has been in power since 2023, but really for the last 20 years, New Zealand has actually put a lot of effort into the Gulf region, mainly because of trade. That has been the driving force, and New Zealand has signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the UAE that was signed back in 2020. Well, it was concluded in 2024. It came into force last year, 2025. And also a free trade agreement with the wider six-member Gulf Cooperation Council, all of those wealthy Gulf states, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So that GCC FTA just needs to be ratified, but it has been agreed upon. So that has been New Zealand's big motivation, I think, over the last 20 years in the Gulf, but also security. And New Zealand troops have been involved in many multilateral deployments in the Middle East over the last 20 years or so, particularly after September 11th, and New Zealand sent out frigates to the region for anti-terrorism patrols and so on. But New Zealand was also using the Gulf as a base for multilateral deployments elsewhere in the wider region, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, when it came to the rebuilding of Iraq, also the campaign against Islamic State. So that early phone call I mentioned with the UAE president, between Christopher Luxon and the UAE president on the 4th of March, he also talked with the Emir of Qatar on the 12th of March, that's Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. Then at the foreign minister level, Winston Peters held phone calls with Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, that's the UAE foreign minister, and the Saudi foreign minister as well, Prince Faisal bin Fahd Al Saud, on the 10th of March. So there has been some dialogue there. I think that's really important. I think it's really useful for New Zealand to express its solidarity with the leaders of these states. I think the more conversation, more dialogue, the better from New Zealand with countries in the region, getting their perspective at that leader level, foreign minister level, finding out what support New Zealand can offer, what there is to do. Now, quite a few New Zealanders do live in the Gulf. The figures that I collected for my thesis and that are popularly talked about, around 5,000 in the United Arab Emirates, 5,000 New Zealanders living there, then numbers of around about anywhere up to 1,000 to 2,000 in total in the other Gulf states. So there is an interest there for New Zealand as well. And New Zealand did send up a couple of C-130J Hercules aircraft in preparation for an evacuation mission. They were actually sent back and were no longer needed. But I think the other point to remember is New Zealand uses and relies upon the Gulf states as major aviation hubs for its travel elsewhere in the world. It's actually challenging to leave New Zealand now and fly to many parts of the world without going through the Gulf. And in the first 20 years of operations, Emirates Airline carried 16 million people in total to and from New Zealand. It's a significant number, and that just shows you the importance of the Gulf also for New Zealand travelers and tourists. Also has a big role for cargo and much of New Zealand's perishable produce, such as fruit, seafood, that is going on these passenger aircraft, also freighter services. So my final questions before we then move on, my questions are, what are the next steps going to be for New Zealand? We've got the fog of war situation at the moment. Both sides, the US and Israel and Iran, seem to be in a maximizing position at the moment, but eventually the window for diplomacy will open. What role, if any, is New Zealand going to play there? Will New Zealand be asked to make some kind of military contribution? I mean, Donald Trump has already been this week saying that he would like contributions from other states that have largely rebuffed him. New Zealand was largely able to dodge that because it wasn't specifically mentioned. But there will be perhaps calls later on for New Zealand to become involved. New Zealand has been involved in many multilateral deployments in the Middle East over the years. But I think the other question is, whether New Zealand can be part of that diplomatic solution to the war. New Zealand has had an embassy in Tehran since 1975. It's actually the oldest embassy that New Zealand has in the Middle East. It has two embassies in the Gulf, one in Abu Dhabi that opened in 2011, the other in Saudi Arabia, which was opened back in 1984. New Zealand has quite a lot of interaction with the Gulf. It has also quite a good relationship with the United States. But it's not a formal US ally. Now, that status can sometimes be useful in negotiations. I'm not saying New Zealand will do this single-handedly, but I think working in with the likes of Oman, that was busy with negotiations before the war between the US and Iran, working in with other small states around the world. I think that's a potential area where New Zealand could definitely do more when it comes to dialogue, de-escalation, diplomacy. So I will stop there and hand back to Sandeep to progress with the remainder of the session.
Geoffrey, thanks so much for the comprehensive overview on the situation. And quite a few of the questions have been answered there, but I'll still have a few points that I got from your assessment that I'll come back to you. But now I want to go back to Mahdi. And Mahdi, in your opening remarks, you actually mentioned about February 28th when the attack began. If I could go back 2 days prior to that, to 26th of February in Geneva, when all parties were meeting to come up with some sort of a solution. There was recently an interview by the Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, where he was asked what really happened in that meeting and was there a possibility that some of his statement could have rubbed Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner the wrong way. And the response to that question was that in that meeting, he actually did mention that they have 440 kg of 60% enriched uranium, which is an open fact, according to him, through the IAEA report. And he added that it is enough to make 10 bombs if enriched further. But they were happy to downgrade it, which is a major concession from Iran. So the question really remains whether, according to the foreign minister of Iran, whether his words were properly conveyed or interpreted before the president of US, Mr. Trump. And so my question is, could this war have actually stemmed from a combination of misinterpretation, prompting a certain urgency to launch an attack on Iran, where supposedly the negotiations were going really well, especially according to Oman, who's been a dependable intermediary?
Sorry, couldn't unmute myself. The host needs to unmute. So yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, you know, a lot of the discussions here on the ground amongst locals that I've been meeting is very much focused on to what extent were the negotiations going well before this war got kickstarted, and the attacks happened on Iran, killing their supreme leader Ali Khamenei and senior officials, and of course the beginning of the air attack campaign by the US and Israel. The general consensus seems to
Mahdi, it seems that your connection is breaking up a little bit there, so just hand back to Sandeep for a moment.
Okay, while we fix that connection, maybe I can just move to Geoffrey. If Geoffrey, you've got any comments on that question?
I would, and it's a shame Mahdi had some great insights there. Hopefully he's back in a moment and can continue. But I would say I don't think the US was ever seriously negotiating, and this is one of the problems with this conflict, that the negotiations at the time that they were happening felt like they were a deception in a sense from the United States, or that the United States was going through the motions on this. I don't ever feel that they were a serious attempt. And it was the same the last time around. Before the 12-day war in June 2025, we had the same thing, Donald Trump supposedly negotiating, but not doing so really in good faith. And I think we saw that with the frustration of the Omani foreign minister coming out on the eve of the war, going on US television on CBS, speaking directly to the American people and the American policymakers because he couldn't get through any other way, I think, at that point, and pointing out, the general nature of a deal that would have been incredibly good. That would have been better than the JCPOA, that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iranian nuclear deal that Donald Trump tore up in 2018. And yet the US just wasn't interested. And in the end, why this war happened the way it did, I just think comes down to opportunity. Donald Trump saw an opportunity. He was being informed by his intelligence services and by Israeli intelligence that, look, the supreme leader and all the leadership are meeting on that Saturday morning, the 28th of February. We've got a chance to take them out. And they did that. And Donald Trump loves these big performative strikes. And it was, in a sense, tactically very, very successful. And for Donald Trump, who, had become accustomed to these kind of big flourishes, that was just the kind of thing that he likes. You remember he kidnapped Nicolas Maduro at the start of January. He had that decapitation strike on Qasem Soleimani back in 2020, January 2020. He had the 12-day war where he came in at the end with a performative strike on Fordo, on the nuclear sites. And then there was almost no cost to that. There was just a small performative retaliatory strike by Iran on the Al Udeid airbase in Qatar. And I think Donald Trump thought that Iran is so weak, they won't be able to fight back. We'll do this decapitation strike. The regime will be destroyed. People will rise up, and Iran will be transformed. I think that's what his advisors were telling him. He's saying, look, let's do it now. That's now or never, Donald. And we can change the Middle East for good. And certainly he's done that. He's changed the Middle East for good, but I don't think in quite the way that he was seeking to.
Geoffrey, that kind of leads into my following question, but I think Mahdi's back with us, so I'll probably take his comment on that question. Mahdi.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened with my internet connection. I don't know where it got cut off, but I'll just kind of restart kind of what I was saying. So ultimately, I think pretty much aligned with Dr. Miller here in the sense that I think the negotiations were going well, yet they were not going probably as fast as Donald Trump wanted. And I think when Donald Trump saw an opportunity to strike and decapitate the leadership of Iran, he took that opportunity, in collaboration with Israel and through Israeli intel and that form of collaboration. So I think ultimately he did that without enough consideration for the ramifications it would have on the Gulf states. And the importance of the Gulf states, I don't think should be discounted for U.S. foreign policy. Whether it's the Strait of Hormuz, of course, very close to us and a source of many of our exports to the world, but also in terms of the fact that we're a host to a multitude of nationalities and, of course, a host to U.S. forces. And not just U.S. forces, but multilateral forces, the combined maritime forces in Bahrain and various other bases, including the UK and also in Bahrain and other Gulf states. So in terms of Western military presence in the Middle East, the Gulf states are hosts to a large extent. And I think to a large extent that was a miscalculation by Donald Trump. But I don't think those negotiations were being held in good faith anyway, and not in good faith by either side. I think the Iranians, also should have realized that they were dealing with Donald Trump and not dealing with some, good faith president of the United States that prioritizes diplomacy. And I think they should have probably dealt with those negotiations in a hastier manner and not kind of pulled it to a large extent through a longer timeline than it needed to be. And I think they were willing to concede many of the aspects that the US wanted, but just took their time. And that ultimately led, or partly, to this war as well, also ensuing.
Oh, that's a great assessment, Mahdi. I want to pose this question to both of you all, leading from something that Geoffrey mentioned in his opening statement about the polymarket consensus of when the war is likely to get over. Um, and I want to quote a leading American expert in international security, Robert Peck, who basically described this situation as an escalation trap, where there are initial tactical success leading to a strategic failure, followed by horizontal escalation, is what we are seeing right now in Gulf. And the reality is that the air power will never be able to achieve a regime change unless there is an on-ground operation, to which US and Israel both look highly reluctant. And recently, the deputy foreign minister of Iran, Khatib Zadeh, who was participating at the Observer Research Foundation's Raisina Dialogue Mahdi in New Delhi, also mentioned something similar, whereby he was describing the Indo-Persian wisdom of having a chess mentality where they go in with a strategic and a patient outlook rather than a US-led, in his words, football mentality, which is short-sighted. So do you think is this US is not trapped in this dynamic of this conflict with Iran? Is this really an escalation trap that they find themselves in? And probably I'll start with Geoffrey for his comment, and then Mahdi can follow up.
Yeah, thanks, Sandeep. Yes, I would subscribe to the escalation trap theory. I just don't think the US and Donald Trump really have any kind of strategy here. They had planned solely really on for this decapitation strike, as they would see it, and they didn't really have a grand plan for the time afterwards because they didn't think they would need it. And Donald Trump released his video the day this all began on the 28th of February, and it was very clearly aimed at there would be a period of severe bombing, intense bombing of Iran, and then people were expected to rise up and overthrow the regime. So everything that has happened since somehow has come as a great surprise to the Trump administration, even though closing the Strait of Hormuz was always going to be one of the cards that Iran had to play. Um, they threw the kitchen sink back at the United States in the retaliation within hours of the US-Israeli strikes beginning. They were attacking all of the Gulf states, pretty much within 24 hours of the war beginning. All of the Gulf states, plus Jordan, plus Iraq, plus Israel, were all being attacked, and then that widened even further to the likes of Cyprus, Azerbaijan, others as well within days. So Iran really went all out, and they always were going to go all out. If their supreme leader and so many in the leadership were killed, whatever the 45 leaders who were killed in that initial strike, they were never going to hold back. So then the problem became for the United States, well, what do you do next? Just keep bombing. And that is, I think, what the escalation trap is all about, that it just becomes about, well, we'll bomb harder. The regime hasn't fallen yet. Let's bomb some more. Let's use new types of bombs. Let's bomb the oil facilities. That's what Israel then did in the first weekend. So a week after the war began, Israel targeted oil facilities, oil depots in Iran. And what did that lead to? It led to Iran then targeting refineries, oil depots on the Gulf side, and we saw that massive oil depot near Dubai Airport being targeted a couple of days ago. So that's been another round of escalation. Then Trump went for bombing Hag Island, the strategic island in the north of the Gulf, where Iran exports a lot of its oil from. So that was then the next target. But none of this is making really any difference to the overall picture. The fact is that Iran is still has the wherewithal to fight back, in particular through these drone strikes, and just a small number of drone strikes can cause a lot of havoc when it comes to preventing international shipping flowing through the Strait of Hormuz and oil supplies. And just the fear of drone strikes is almost enough to stop these ships flowing through the Strait of Hormuz because they can't get insurance. They don't want to go through a war zone or even a potential war zone. So this is the situation in which we find ourselves, where Iran is still able to send out, despite all of these airstrikes and bombing, they're still able to send out a total of around 100 drones and missiles a day, three-quarters drones, a quarter ballistic missiles. Even after all of these bombings, the US hasn't even managed to stop the ballistic missiles. It's not even the case that they've stopped the ballistic missiles and it's only now the smaller drones that are getting through. It's still both, and we're 2.5 weeks in.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Mahdi?
Yeah, very much agreed here with Dr. Miller. I think to a large extent, the US did fall in an escalation trap. But the key question here is Iran's strategy. And I think that's also what you're asking, Sandeep, is what is the Iranian strategy here? And how come the strategy kind of is outpacing the US strategy? That's the way I interpreted your question to a certain extent, and the words of the Iranian foreign minister or deputy foreign minister. And I think Iran is realizing that by falling into the playbook of a survival mode where they're just, lashing out from a corner and punching everyone is something that's effective as a tactic to the larger strategy of ensuring that when they're attacked, the global economy is impacted. And their neighbors, us, the Gulf countries, who have proven to be useful interlocutors with the West, would mediate on Iran's behalf to de-escalate as stakeholders rather than as facilitators of a discussion between Iran and the US, right? So now we are interested as stakeholders of this conflict as being targeted by Iran to make sure that there's a de-escalation without necessarily facilitating even a conversation between Iran and the US. We're partly probably pushing for de-escalation regardless of what Iran wants or regardless of what Iran communicates to us is because now we're interested in de-escalation. So that's a benefit to Iran's strategy. The other benefit is I think they're realizing that us in the Gulf, we're very unlikely to show anything but restraint in terms of dealing with them and not necessarily retaliating, despite them, again, indiscriminately attacking civilian and critical infrastructure. And that's because we don't want to be dragged into this conflict when or if the US decides, it's time to draw out and it's time to leave those neighbors to sort this out amongst themselves. And of course, sorting this out amongst ourselves is not going to be an easy task. Iran has been a neighbor that's intent on interfering in our domestic affairs for a very long time and meddling into the domestic affairs of, particularly Bahrain. And now what we're seeing as well with hidden cells being uncovered in Kuwait and Qatar, I think all of these risks are something that never really showed our capability of being good neighbors to each other. And I think Iran is betting on the fact that we don't want to make sure that there's further bad blood by going on the offensive. So that again is something straight out of a playbook of really kind of an Iran that's in a corner and willing to lash out and showcase its teeth and its firepower and really deter any further escalation by the Gulf states joining or perhaps even calling for escalation. So that's at least Iran's playbook in terms of attacking the Gulf states.
Thanks, Mahdi. I can see a lot of questions coming from our members. So I'll pace through some of the questions that I have, and probably we have the last eight odd minutes. And Max, I'll request you to maybe extend the Q&A by another 5 to 7 minutes, just because we started later by 5 minutes. But just to follow up of the previous question, I want to share something very interesting that I came across yesterday. because I'm currently in Mumbai. I'm moderating this session from here, and I'm viewing a lot of local news where you have Iranians and Israelis coming and talking to the news channels over here, because of course India talks to both of them. And there's something interesting that the Israeli ambassador to India, Ruwen Azar, said yesterday to a news channel where he was on, that about the end game of this. And he outlined two possible end games in this recent interview of his. First, Iran comes to the negotiating table for a political solution, which he sees as highly unlikely. And the second is Israel exhausts its military efforts, debilitating Iran dramatically and freeing Israel from the current threat in a foreseeable future without any diplomatic resolution. Is this the kind of end game that you guys envisage, where Israel and US simply are kicking the can down the road for another war to happen in the next decade without really solving the issue? Maybe a quick comment from each of you all, and I can go to my next question, which I've consolidated two questions into one in the interest of time. Mahdi, and then Geoffrey.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, to a large extent, I don't expect this to be. I think even if there is a ceasefire at the moment, I expect this conflict to resurface, and I don't think it's going to be a matter of 10 years. I think it's going to be a shorter time period. You know, we this conflict kind of repeating, I think, is something that's becoming very likely, unless, of course, we see complete regime change in Iran and a lack of a power vacuum and a fantasy scenario where you have a regime that's cooperative regionally and globally. But that's the most unlikely scenario. The most likely scenario, I think, is some form of ceasefire, with Iran continuing a threatening posture towards its neighbors and towards the world, and occasional outbursts from Israel and the US attacking Iran. But then also, I think, even if there's a ceasefire, I think Iran will double down on its ability to mobilize proxies, on its ability to interfere in domestic affairs regionally and globally. And that again would prompt further escalation moving forward. So I don't expect any ceasefire at the moment to be the end of hostilities.
Geoffrey?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. All of those things that Mahdi said, it's a possibility that Donald Trump just takes his ball and goes home. But Iran gets a vote in this, and if they want the war to continue, they've shown that they've been able to withstand an enormous air campaign from not just Israel, but the United States, the world's most powerful military, as well. And even just a small amount of capability, as long as it's not zero, they've got the ability to prolong this conflict and continue it. Because I think Iran is motivated to discourage the United States and Israel from starting yet another war in the future. And that would be one way of doing that, would just to say, well, you don't decide when the war ends, we do. That's an enormous amount of power and leverage that they would have. But I do think we need a diplomatic solution to this. The problem is that the United States has effectively cheapened diplomacy through its actions by not taking that diplomacy in good faith before the war. And I mean, there's just so many, I don't know, inconsistencies, contradictions with Donald Trump. But I think the biggest one, he perfects the art of the deal, and he had a great deal in the making on February 26th when those talks were held in Geneva, and that came out through the Omani foreign minister's interview to CBS on the 27th of February. And he walked away and said, well, that's not good enough for me. I'm going to get everything that I want. I'm going to do it by bombing, and we'll get a better outcome that way. And I think Donald Trump, and you see in his comments this week, and he's lashing out at NATO allies and so on. He's all over the place. He knows that it's not going well. He really does.
Look, there is so much ground to cover over here, right from the role of EU to Russia to China, non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. But I'm going to probably stick to what really matters for our members over here, which is New Zealand. And I've got two parts to this question. First is about the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, we all knew that Strait of Hormuz is handling about 20 to 30% of global oil trade, and it's very vital for the world's energy security. Having gone into a conflict like that, knowing very well that that could be the choke point, uh, U.S. and Israel have definitely gone in a haste, and could they have gone more wrong than this? That's the first part of the question. The second is very New Zealand focused. We are an export-driven economy and nation, but we do send fewer than 5% of our exports directly to the Middle East, Geoffrey, as per some of your analysis as well. But we're already feeling the heat of the rising fuel prices, inflation. Our GDP is going to contract as a result of this war as well. So, what does this really mean for New Zealand, and not just economically, but in terms of a broader strategic implications? Just to summarize, this Strait of Hormuz and New Zealand's economic and strategic implications of this. And we could start with Geoffrey and then go to Mahdi for his comment.
Yeah, thanks, Sandeep. I'll focus on that second part of the question. I mean, the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, we're seeing every day why it is so significant to the world, and it can have an enormous impact. And we knew that. I mean, you can go on YouTube, there are all kinds of geopolitics videos from before this war that showed exactly what would happen in this war that has happened. So, you know, you didn't have to be a genius to see that this was the choke point, but Donald Trump underestimated that threat. With regards to New Zealand and its relations with the Gulf and the wider Middle East, I think New Zealand to a degree underestimates the Middle East. Um, Maybe that has also come from our determined focus on Asia and where we see Asia. You know, New Zealanders, I think, define Asia traditionally been more East Asia. Now it's gone to as far as India, but not beyond that. And yet the Middle East can fit into that broader sense of Asia as well. And New Zealand's sixth biggest export market is now the Gulf Cooperation Council, these six wealthy countries in the Gulf region. They're good markets to New Zealand. They're good friends to New Zealand. New Zealand has done well there. New Zealand exports over $3 billion worth of goods and services every year. It's a particularly important market for dairy products, meat, fruit. Uh, in terms of climate, the Gulf doesn't have any natural rivers. It means, and food security is a big concern. Why? Because of what we're seeing now. I mean, you see the issues. So New Zealand ticks so many boxes for the Gulf states. But I'd say it's also more than that. I mean, most of the Gulf states, including Bahrain, where Mahdi is speaking to us now, they are small states. Most of them, apart from Saudi Arabia, really fit into the umbrella of small states. They've all got populations of 10 million or less, in many cases, far less than that. In many cases, some cases, they're smaller than New Zealanders. If you think of Qatar, Bahrain, they have populations smaller than New Zealand. Oman is about the same size. So I think in some ways, you know, we actually have a lot in common. We have, in some ways, more in common with the likes of Oman than much bigger states that we like to compare ourselves with, be it Australia, be it UK, and so on, where we have cultural similarities, but these are much bigger powers. They are either G7 members or G20 members or middle powers. Just look at Australia, a population of nearly 30 million. So I think there's a lot New Zealand can do with the Gulf, and that was certainly one of the focuses of my PhD research on New Zealand's relations with the Gulf states. I think New Zealand probably needs to invest more resources into understanding the Middle East. We don't have really any institutional capability focusing on the Middle East, and I think that's a mistake because, as you can see from the last couple of weeks, things do tend to happen in the Middle East and happen quite dramatically.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, I think, you know, from the perspective of the Gulf states, all our relationships that we've built over the
Mahdi?
years with. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, all the relationships we built over the years, I think, are being stress tested at the moment, including the relationship with New Zealand. And I think it's important on the part of Gulf states and New Zealand's future collaboration, for there to be some form of solidarity during this war, whether it's in terms of support for food supplies and benefiting from the trade agreements that have been set in place, or in terms of um, other aspects of collaboration. I know there was a co-sponsoring of New Zealand towards the UN Security Council resolution condemning the Iranian attacks on the Gulf states. And that is, I think, where the relationship can only get stronger. In the end, I mean, this war is temporary. This is the consensus that we're seeing is, this war will be temporary, and the Gulf will recover. And I think it's important that relationships that come to fruition from the stress test also includes New Zealand, and this is partly why I personally am very, very much eager to hear all the questions here today.
Thanks, Mahdi. That probably brings the moderation part of the session today to an end. And I just wanted to leave the audience with a few lines of reflection shared by Mahdi while he was driving from Dubai to Bahrain. And it's about the Gulf solidarity. And often we see that adversity brings people together. And in that light, I think, Mahdi, you said something really beautiful where you shared on your, I think, LinkedIn post that the threats are shared, the consequences are shared, the solutions will be shared, and the capitals are in one spirit. So probably on that note, if I can hand over to Max and take the Q&A session forward.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sandeep. We do have a lot of questions in the comments to get through, and not a lot of time left. If it's okay with the two panelists, I will just give us about 10 to 15 minutes to answer these questions, but we will try to move through them relatively quickly. I will ask the questions in the order that they've been posed in the chat, but I will just merge a few together that, in my view, are dealing with similar topics. Starting with, we've had a couple of questions from Umaima as well as Alex Fife, which relate to the topic of the international order and what this conflict means for international law. So I'm just going to merge them together, and I think Alex Fife summarized the questions quite well in this question, which I'll just read out. I'll pose this to Geoffrey first, and then I'll flip it over to Mahdi. The nuclear capability of Iran has been a long-standing topic of international political relations, with multiple organizations involved in the management of the development of nuclear energy and/or weaponry in the state. With ongoing negotiations occurring, it seems that despite this, the current US government has been able to take military action with no consideration to international law and relations, or the deadly risk to civilians. How much of a serious risk do you think this is to power relations and the international order? And then I'm just going to tack on to that question a second one that Alex also asked, which I think is related, but looking more from a New Zealand perspective. Aotearoa has a strong history of peace and anti-nuclear standing, even in our legislation. Despite this, there's been a perception that the New Zealand government or that the New Zealand state is not taking a strong enough view on this conflict. As an active country within the global political economy, we are involved whether we like it or not. It seems reckless for our government to reject this. Moreover, on one hand, our government is saying we support the USA. On the other, we don't want to be involved. To phrase that as a question, do you think the historically peaceful position of our country is at risk under this current government, given their response to this war? So there are two similar but perhaps interconnected questions there. Firstly, about the effect of this conflict on the international legal order as a whole, and secondly, on the position of New Zealand and how New Zealand's reputation may be affected by their perceived response to this conflict. So I'll throw that over to Geoffrey first.
Yeah, thanks for that, Max. Look, obviously a big question, lots of things to unpack there. But look, international law and the international rules-based order, it doesn't get changed overnight, it gets chipped away at. And I think every time you get things happening, as they did on February 28th, or at the start of January when Donald Trump kidnapped Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, we get precedents created that are not helpful. And so that's what I would say there with international law. I'm not a lawyer, I don't come from a law background, but I think, look, we have these norms in international law for a reason, and they are a construct to a degree and artificial, and there are rules that humans impose upon themselves. But I think we're probably better off for them, and certainly New Zealand as a small state is better off with them. And that leads me to the next part of that question. New Zealand, with its nuclear-free credentials, its reputation for calling for peace, for these kinds of things. I think New Zealand has a really good reputation in these areas, and it might surprise some New Zealanders to know just how well thought of New Zealand is in many parts of the world, but also in perhaps even particularly in the Middle East. Some of this is also quite recent because of the Christchurch mosque attacks back in 2019. To bring it back to Christchurch, of course, where you were based, and New Zealand's response to that, and compassionate response, led by Jacinda Ardern, but it wasn't just the Prime Minister, it was the whole country's response. It really was noticed and it was appreciated in Muslim countries and particularly in the Middle East. And New Zealand's response to those attacks, it was on the front pages for days of the newspapers in the Arab world. I know that because I was in Cairo at the time and it went along to the newspaper seller every day and saw pictures from Christchurch on the front page and headlines. And it was New Zealand's response as much as anything that really was appreciated. It wasn't what happened itself, it was the way that New Zealand responded to that. So it actually, this enormous tragedy of the mosque shootings that killed 51 Muslims, the New Zealand's compassionate response to that is very warmly remembered. So when it comes to New Zealand's role, I do think New Zealand can do more than it thinks, and New Zealand likes to sometimes portray itself as we're too far away, we can't do anything. And in that statement from the 1st of March, New Zealand called for negotiations, but 2 days later in Parliament, when Christopher Luxon spoke, he said New Zealand's not central to the Middle East, we're a long way. We don't overestimate our influence. And I think, New Zealand also has a responsibility here, and we should be doing what we can. It does affect us, and we've got a contribution to make. Now, there are different ways in which you can make that contribution. Right now, maybe it is just expressing solidarity, getting on the phone, finding out what's going on and learning as much and fact-finding. But I think New Zealand should stand ready to help when it comes to the diplomatic track. It's not easy work. It's a thankless task, as Oman would probably be able to tell you. And you can get betrayed and feel like it was all a wasted time. But I don't think that's a reason not to try. I think New Zealand can and should do what it can, and it should do more, and it can do more in this space. In the end, there aren't that many small democracies in the world. New Zealand's a small state, good relations with lots of different countries, including the United States, including the Gulf states. I mean, there's a basis there. I'm not saying New Zealand can do it on its own. It needs to work in closely with others. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think the key question as well is to what extent there's an ethical obligation, and I think this is partly as well where Dr. Miller is hinting at is it's one thing to say, well, okay, the United States right now is interested in exercising its full power to making sure that the world is unipolar and it controls to a large extent for the international affairs of the globe, especially the regional affairs of the Middle East at the moment. But that then there's an ethical obligation, I think, on the parts of other states, including New Zealand, including the Gulf states, including various international actors, to challenge that and to make sure that, well, okay, what you do, what the United States does affect everyone at the moment. And this sort of chipping away at the international rules-based order is not acceptable, and puts everyone in harm's way. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. So I think partly there's an ethical obligation as well to challenge the United States to the best of our abilities and be able to express frustrations, not necessarily threaten something that we can do, which is cut strategic ties with the United States. And the United States is a powerful country that will remain a big part of the global order for a long time to come. Probably the most important part of the global order for a long time to come. But to challenge their slow shift away from maintaining the international rules-based order. I think that there's an ethical obligation for that because it's the international rules-based order that has maintained to a large extent peace and development over the past few decades since the World War. So I'll stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. This next question I'll pose to Mahdi first and then to Jeff. Just bearing in mind we do have a few more questions to go, so I will just ask you to keep your answers as concise as possible, purely so that we have a chance to get through as many as we can. This question is from Josh Brown. Trump is currently seeking allies to protect the Strait of Hormuz. The United Arab Emirates has been interested to be involved in this effort. Is it possible, given New Zealand's pragmatic and trade-focused trade policy, that it might join this alliance as well? Mahdi, I'll leave that to you.
Possible. I'm not sure. I'll let Dr. Miller answer the possibility of that, but whether it would be welcome, I think that's certainly the case. I think all the Gulf countries would be welcoming international involvement at the moment, besides the United States and Israel, to maintain some form of return to normalcy and order, and of course, facilitation of trade through the Strait of Hormuz, but ultimately as well to deter Iran. I think some form of international mobilization, not bombing Iran per se, but international mobilization to deter Iran from escalating further and quote unquote retaliating towards the Gulf states, I think will be welcome on our part, including that from New Zealand. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Geoffrey, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Josh, for that question. Look, New Zealand has been involved, as I said earlier, in all kinds of multilateral deployments, including naval deployments, since the early 2000s, even going back to the 90s in isolated form. But I think that would have to come, in terms of what New Zealand has to offer, after any ceasefire. It would be more of a patrol or a surveillance kind of mission. New Zealand, just simply in terms of its capabilities, doesn't have destroyer class ships to offer. It's got a couple of frigates, and that's really what New Zealand's capabilities are. They are used in these anti-terrorism patrols and surveillance patrols in the Middle East. That's the kind of thing New Zealand can offer. But I think right now, frankly, it would be a suicide mission going into the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that's why much bigger countries like the UK, like Germany, like Australia, all basically said no. They don't want to get involved at this point to Donald Trump this week. And I think New Zealand, that would certainly be the case for New Zealand as well at the moment. And New Zealand, even if it wanted to, doesn't have the kinds of ships, I think, that could be used at this point.
All right, thank you for that. This next question I'll also pose to Mahdi first and then move to Geoffrey. Ollie Law says, Kia ora from Kuala Lumpur. All eyes are on Iran, the US, and the Middle East. But what evidence is there that we are monitoring and communicating with China? The CCP will be monitoring how the US responds to counterattacks from Iran, whether NATO moves or dissolves, and where the US Navy's focus will be. This may be the opportunity China needed to move on Taiwan or APAC. How are the New Zealand and UAE governments preparing for escalation between other nations? Quite a big question there, and also shifting the focus out a bit more to look at the wider context. So Mahdi, I'll move that to you first to see what your thoughts are on that.
I'm not sure if I'll be able to answer that question directly, but I do want to. It did spark a thought that I hope also answers partly the spirit of the question, which is essentially that I think the world will be looking at the way the Western alliances respond and come to the aid of the Gulf countries by assessing as well the value of such an alliance with the West. And I think this is the moment where presumably a part of the world that has been very strongly aligned with the United States and its partners for decades is now stress testing again that relationship with the United States and to see whether the United States and its partners will come to the aid of will come to our aid in a time of need. And I think the wider world will be watching and assessing, well, okay, is this something that outside a formal alliance like NATO, is there value really in that kind of alliance and alignment with the West? So I think that will be the key question looking forward. I'm not really sure about the China-Taiwan dynamics, so I won't go there.
Okay, brilliant. I'll throw that to Geoffrey then, and then we'll have time for one more very quick question, and then we'll have to wrap up. Geoffrey.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Look, on China, I think it's interesting to look at last week in the United Nations Security Council, as Mahdi intimated earlier. China and Russia did not veto a resolution. It was, I think, Resolution 2817, if I recall, that condemned the attacks on the Gulf states. I mean, it was quite remarkable that, I mean, these days it's remarkable if any resolution is adopted in the Security Council. And this one, I think, unfortunately, the grand theorists who look at the world as, with these great powers and that everything is a great strategy, I think they would be a bit disappointed by all of that. And I don't think there is any real substantial evidence that Russia and China are secretly backing Iran in this war. And I think China is concerned about its oil supplies, quite frankly. 3/4 of the supplies going through the Strait of Hormuz go to Asia. I think about 60% of China's supplies come from the Gulf. So I don't look. Interesting question. What's happening with China and Taiwan? But look, at the moment, I just think the reality is that China has not been starting wars around the world in recent decades. That just isn't the case. And I think they'll be even less likely to be wanting to start wars given the situation we're facing at the moment. So let's get the situation sorted before we get too carried away about China and Taiwan. But I did note the New Zealand and Defence ministers were in Australia yesterday with their Australian counterparts for a 2+2 meeting, and they issued a very long joint statement with all kinds of hawkish statements aimed at China at the bottom. I don't think that kind of thing is that helpful at the moment, and I think New Zealand needs to be working quite closely with the likes of China. China's New Zealand's biggest trading partner, has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. I think it would be more helpful and more constructive to look at diplomacy and see again what outside states can do, like New Zealand, like China, the ones who are not involved directly in the Middle East at the moment. Think, well, what is the most productive option? What helpful things can we do to diffuse this conflict and go back to peace? Because it has a tremendous destabilizing impact on the world economy. And China, in the end, it lives from the oil that it gets from the Gulf region, from the Middle East.
Beautiful. And the way you've answered that has led very well into my next question, which I'll ask you to just answer very, very quickly because we are running over time now. This is from Dani, and Dani says, I'm a Malaysian and we border next to our own checkpoint, the Malacca Strait. Being in the Indo-Pacific, especially with the narrative of potential US-China conflict, where choke points can be weaponized by belligerents. What would your advice be to Southeast Asian countries or countries in the Indo-Pacific in being prepared to avoid the same outcome where entangled alliances are being dragged in and choke points are being weaponized? How does one stay neutral when we see this sort of geopolitical weaponization of choke points and military bases? And I'll throw that to Geoffrey first for a very quick response, and then also to Mahdi to wrap us up. Geoffrey, take it away.
Thanks, Max. Look, the lesson of this conflict is we should go for the diplomatic option and go for the diplomatic solution. That deal that was offered back on the 26th of February in Geneva looks pretty good right now from where I'm sitting, and I reckon from where Donald Trump is sitting right now too. I think he's probably got buyer's remorse, bomber's remorse, given everything that has happened in the past 2.5 weeks. And I think the lesson for anyone looking on at this conflict is that go for the diplomatic solution. Do not make the perfect the enemy of the good. Even if it's not a perfect deal, it is going to be an awful lot better than a destructive conflict without seemingly an off-ramp like we're in at the moment. that's what I would say to that.
Beautiful. And then for the final words from Mahdi, yeah, just the same question. What are the lessons to be learned from this conflict?
While I agree with Dr. Miller, I think diplomacy is the best option, and I think that's the key lesson. But I will add to it one thing, and that's I think a lesson that we're taking away here in the Gulf, but also a lesson that I think the world should be taking away, is conflicts are unpredictable and they can be just around the corner, for many regions of the world. And I think it's important to be prepared for those conflicts. Governments have responsibility towards their people, and that means bolstering defense supplies, military spending, on defense, sheltering, ensuring there are shelters in place. And that's not an alarmist view. I think that's a view of just like governments spend our tax money on and other forms of funds on various services. There's also a service of a public good of protecting people in times of crisis. And to imagine a world where crises like this don't happen, having just recovered from a pandemic and then now this war and the financial crisis before that. I mean, there are global crises that happen. Then, of course, there are more regional crises that happen on a regular basis. And it's important to be prepared for those. There's no time to then bite your nails and say, well, I wish we wish we were prepared with more air defenses, or we wish we were prepared with more shelters. It's important to spend on those. And it's important, I think, for the public to be aware that military spending on defense is a public good that's essentially could protect them in a time of crisis. And in the Gulf here, we've been very much grateful, I think, in retrospect, for the vast spending on defense that has occurred over the past few years, because that's what essentially has led us to a position of having good air defenses, early warning systems, and things that have enabled us to somehow, in an odd way, have a normal life amidst being bombed. So I think I'll end with that.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both so much, and also for staying over time to answer all of the questions that we've had from our attendees here at this event. This has been a very widely attended event, so we're very happy to see the interest, and thank you very much to Geoffrey Miller and Mahdi Ghuloom that you were able to come here and speak to us from your deep well of knowledge. With that, I'll just wrap this event up. To those who weren't able to stay for the whole thing, or who would like to refer back to this session has been recorded, and we will be uploading it shortly on the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs YouTube channel. So make sure to follow that, and also give us a follow on our LinkedIn page at the same time, so that you can catch up to date with all of the following events that we'll be putting on this year. And with that, I'll just end the session. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and have a lovely rest of your week. Cheers.